This evening, as we continue our survey of the Old Testament, our historical survey of the Old Testament, we have now completed the book of Judges, and we are entering another book, entering the book of 1 Samuel. Now, for the purposes of this study, I am going to be paralleling the account in Chronicles with the accounts in Samuel and Kings. I might mention a little bit to begin with of the distinction between those books. Samuel and Kings is a successive story. In other words, 1 Kings simply picks up where 2 Samuel leaves off. The exact story flow comes right on through Judges. 1 Samuel picks up the story where Judges end, continues right on through consecutively through 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings. And that is the story flow of it. Samuel and Kings formed in the Hebrew canon one book as it was considered. It was divided into 4 scrolls simply because of length and the amount of space that it took up. So as a result of that, we have it broken down. But Chronicles is different. Chronicles includes material that is covered in Samuel and Kings. In other words, Chronicles overlaps with that same time period, but it tells the story from an entirely different perspective. There are details that Samuel and Kings leave out that Chronicles emphasizes. And yet Chronicles does not attempt to simply retell the story of Samuel and Kings. Samuel and Kings were written at an earlier period of time, undoubtedly at least begun by Samuel. You know, he's the logical one to have started the book of Samuel. He didn't write it all because it continues on after his death, but he was one of the major ones. It is considered that Isaiah was one of the major compilers of the conclusion of it, and Jeremiah was the one who gave it to us who completed that. Because the story comes down to Jeremiah's time, and 2 Kings ends during Jeremiah's ministry. It gives that successive story, telling the story of Israel and Judah on down to the captivity first of Israel and the captivity of Judah. Chronicles was written at a much later time. Chronicles was written by Ezra after the captivity and after the restoration. Chronicles was written from the standpoint of Jerusalem, from the priestly standpoint, a temple standpoint. It was to focus in the attention of the people to understand the story, to make plain where God was working. You see, it was in the aftermath of the Jews' return from Babylon that a controversy arose with the Samaritans, who claimed that they also were a repository of God's truth and sought to involve themselves. And that was not the case. Christ made that very plain in the New Testament, the scripture that we are familiar with, at least have read over, maybe not thought of it in this context, but it is what Christ told the woman at the well in Samaria. And what he told her, or she asked him the question, as is recorded in John chapter 4, she said in verse 19, the woman said unto him, Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worship in this mountain, Mount Gerizim in Samaria. She said, Our fathers worshipped in this mountain, in Mount Gerizim. And you say, you Jews, say that Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship. Jesus said unto her, Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you shall neither in this mountain nor yet at Jerusalem worship the Father. So first he said, look, the time is coming when the question is going to be moot because it's not going to be either place. Both of these places are going to be destroyed. But then he told her in verse 22, you Samaritans worship you know not what. We know what we worship. We Jews know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. Salvation was not of the Samaritans, it was of the Jews. Mount Gerizim was not the place, Jerusalem was. And Christ made that evident when she confronted him with the question that you Samaritans really don't understand what you're doing. You don't know what you're doing. We Jews do, because salvation is of the Jews. Chronicles was written to emphasize that point because it tells the story. When you go through Chronicles, what you know is that the first few chapters, let's say the first about 9 chapters, kind of set the stage. The first few chapters deal with genealogy. And then you get even into the latter part of the genealogy and it focuses in on the line of David. And all of the rest of First Chronicles is the story of King David. Virtually the whole book. A few chapters set the stage with genealogy, and then the rest of the book is the life of King David. Focusing in on how Jerusalem became the capital, how the temple, how that David and the line of David that was centered there. And then we come into Second Chronicles and we focus in a large portion of the book on Solomon, on Jerusalem, on the temple, the building of the temple, the establishment of the courses of priests and Levites in the temple service. And then as you go on through Second Chronicles, you'll find that primarily the rest of the book of Second Chronicles virtually leaves out the kings of Israel. It only mentions some of them in passing. It focuses in on the kings of Judah, primarily on the times when there was a religious revival in Judah. Focuses in on King Hezekiah and King Josiah primarily, to a lesser extent King Jehoshaphat. But it focuses in on those periods. The periods of revival, the periods that centered around Jerusalem and a restoration of worship there. Just very, very brief mention. Saul gets summed up in a matter of a few verses. Now that contrasts greatly to 1 Samuel, which spends chapters telling you about King Saul. Chronicles sums him up in a few verses. Just barely mentions his name. And the same as you go on through the story. Chronicles was written from an entirely different standpoint. It supplements the story in Samuel and Kings from a particular standpoint. It was written to emphasize particular things that needed to be learned that were not entirely clear if all you had was Samuel and Kings. It was written to emphasize the story from a different standpoint. For the purpose of this Bible study, we are paralleling the accounts so that we might better get a view of what is involved and because this is a historical survey of the Old Testament. As I mentioned in terms of Chronicles, it's a presentation of the historical events from a religious angle. It was written by Ezra at the time of the Restoration. It serves to remind the Jews of their beginnings because it carried them all the way back to Adam. The largest single part is devoted to the history of the reign of King David, centers on Jerusalem as God's chosen city. The dynasty of David is God's chosen line of kings. Points out to the Jews the falseness of the Samaritan claims. It has more limited objectives than the book of Samuel and Kings. Serves as a supplement but not a replacement. Now, as we look here in 1 Chronicles, we'll note Chronicles first, before we get into the story as told in Samuel, because the material that is covered is, at least deals with an earlier historical period. We start out, of course, in Chronicles, and we have genealogy. Now, let's understand, why are all these chapters here in the beginning of 1 Chronicles, why are all these chapters taken up with genealogy? Why do you read all of this? So-and-so begat so-and-so, and it's not all of these genealogies here. Well, it was very important, and as to why it was done, when it was done that way. One of the major portions of this genealogy deals with the Levites and the priests, as well as with various other groupings there. Now, when Chronicles was written at the time of Ezra, we're looking at a period when the Jews went into captivity, when Nebuchadnezzar came in and conquered Jerusalem and first took the Jews into captivity. It was a period of 70 years before the first Jews returned. From the time of the first captivity in 604 until the first Jews returned was right at 70 years. The decree was issued in 535, and they were allowed to return beginning in 535, and it would have been about 534 before any actually returned for the gospel. That's 70 years. Now, here are people who have been away, who have been taken captive 70 years. And now they come back to an area their forefathers left 70 years ago. Yes, there may have been a few individuals who had gone captive, but anybody who had had living memory of what it was like before would have had to have been at least about 80. And you can rest assured very, very few of those would have even been able to have returned had they still been alive. Because when they returned, it was a long, arduous trip from Babylon. They didn't hop on a 747 and sit down at Tel Aviv airport, an hour later. They didn't get on the train. They didn't even get in their Winnebago to camp out. They walked primarily, or if they were a little better off, they may have ridden on a camel. Have you ever tried to ride on a camel? You consider that's not a whole big step up from walking. In fact, some who tried it have gotten off and gone back to walking. But it was a long trip. Now, you think back 70 years, that was the end of World War I. How much do you know about the details of the society and the community where you live in 1918? How much do you know about exactly how things were set up and how they functioned? Now, if you live in an area where you grew up and where your parents lived and your grandparents lived, you may have a little more of an idea. But if you live here, if you've moved here, and you live somewhere way away from where your family did back in 1918, the chances are you know very, very little of how things functioned back there in that period. 70 years is a long time. What we're looking at is people forget. They lose sight of how things function, why they were set up that way, who was in charge of this, and why certain things were done. Now, by the time Ezra came along, it was a generation later. It was 50 years on further down the road. So, the restoration, the rebuilding of the temple had started about 70 years after the captivity. But by the time Ezra was writing, it was even later than that. So, in terms of going back and giving the details of some of these genealogies, as to the priests and the Levites, and as to which group was established over this and over that, it was necessary to establish these things because people had simply forgotten. It was a matter that these records were important. People had needed to be reminded of their roots. They needed to be reminded from whence they came. They had simply lost sight, lost understanding of certain things, of the details. They may have had a certain sketchy idea. You know, portions of the Bible were more important for certain times than for others. These genealogies were crucial for the time of Ezra and Nehemiah and the time immediately after. They're important for us because they give us a historical framework. They give us information that allows us to understand certain portions of the historical framework of the Bible. But it was very crucial for them at that time because it was information they needed in order to reestablish the temple and a functioning priesthood in Jerusalem. There were things that were needed to help them differentiate between who they were and who the Samaritans were, who claimed to be Jews and were not. It was important that certain things be given to provide a certain continuity. Because here are people who have been uprooted, taken away, gone for 70 years and now back. So in a lot of cases, you're looking at the grandchildren of people who had been taken away, who were coming back. And people who had been born in a different land. And, we have to kind of look at it from that perspective to realize how much you lose touch when a 70-year period goes by. Most of us have only a very dim outline of exactly the way things were set up 70 years ago and exactly what our forebearers were doing. Now, some cases you may know more detail, in other cases you may know quite a bit less. But this is the situation. Now, the books of Chronicles give us a brief summary of events from Adam until the beginning of the return of the Jews from Babylon under Zerubbabel. This is from the beginning of 1 Chronicles to the end of 2nd. Chronicles is written from the standpoint of Jerusalem, and it gives only a cursory history of the northern kingdoms. It provides detailed information on genealogies. And there are genealogies given here that you can't find elsewhere. There are some portions are repetitious, but they're repetitious because you need that part to connect on and to make sense of what comes next. We note here in chapters 2, 3, and 4, we have a fairly detailed genealogy of Judah, with various incidents of tribal history included. This was, again, necessary because it was the Jews who were coming back. There were incidents that needed to be recorded of particular peoples who had inherited certain portions of land. People came back, and there are disputes about land, certain villages. Certain families are going to be given those villages. Why? Why are certain people getting certain areas? So they start coming back, and some of them say, well, I think we're supposed to have over there. My grandfather said that was ours. And others say, well, why should that be yours? I like that. I saw it first. I think it ought to be mine. So you have details, you see, giving the background of how it was that certain property came to belong to certain people. And so we have a lot of details on Judah's genealogy given in 2, 3, and 4. We have here in chapter 5, I call your attention verses 1 and 2 because this plainly shows the division of the scepter and birthright promises. This is a key verse. The sons of Reuben, the sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel, for he was the firstborn, but forasmuch as he defiled his father's bed, his birthright was given unto the sons of Joseph, the son of Israel. And the genealogy is not to be reckoned after the birthright. For Judah prevailed above his brethren, and of him came the chief ruler, came the prince, the scepter promise. but the birthright was Joseph. Then he begins to go on into the genealogy of Reuben's descendants. But this is a key in clearly showing the distinction between the birthright and the scepter, and showing who to whom the birthright contained. That the birthright was Joseph, that it was taken from Reuben. And it's interesting because you find that in terms of the birthright blessings that God gave to Joseph, the modern day, that in virtually every case, Reuben was there first. And it just kind of went between their fingers. They were unable to hold on to it. The Louisiana Purchase, the heartland of the U.S., of course, was French first. The Reuben had that heartland of the U.S. first, the Louisiana Purchase. Had Canada first, was in India first, was at Suez first, was at Panama first, in terms of the sea gates. They were at a number of the strategic parts of what became the birthright blessings that came to Joseph. They were there first. And it just kind of went between their fingers. It's interesting, even the battle, even some of the battles. Do you know the name of the battle that was the turning point? It's where the British won Canada from the French. You know what the name of the battle was? Interesting name. It was the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. It's kind of like the first major battle of the Civil War, the war between the states. It was the Battle of Manassas Junction. Interesting term. It's also called the Battle of Bull Run. That was the term that was more commonly used in the North. The term that was more commonly used in the South was the Battle of Manassas Junction. Just an interesting aside because of some of even the names that have been preserved in even modern U.S. and British history. Maybe all coincidence. Well, it's interesting. God just certain things that are there. Well, we see some of this information that is recorded here, and it makes plain what happened to the northern tribes in 1 Chronicles 5 and verse 25. They transgressed against the God of their fathers, went a-whoring after the gods of the people of the land, whom God destroyed before them. And the God of Israel stirred up the spirit of Pharaoh, the king of Assyria, and the spirit of Tiglath-Pileser, the king of Assyria, and he carried them away, even the Reubenites, and the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, and brought them unto Halah, and Habor, and Harah, to the river Gozan, unto this day. That expression, unto this day, you see, this is at the time of Ezra, who gave the canon, completed the canon of the Old Testament, making plain that these northern tribes did not return. Those who say that there is no distinction between Israel and Judah, that it's all the same, they all just came back from captivity and they all mixed and mingled and they're all called the Jews. Chronicles makes plain that that's not true. It makes it very clear that when Israel was carried away, they were still captive unto this day, the time that this was written, years after the Jews had returned from Babylon. Because these cities were the cities of the Medes. This was an area up in a different area from Babylon. It was a part of the Medo-Persian Empire, not of the Babylonian Empire. It had originally been Assyria, but when Assyria fell, the Medes and the Persians split it with Babylon. Okay, chapter 6 goes into the details of genealogies of the Levites. Might call your attention to the prophet Samuel, who is mentioned in 1 Chronicles 6:28 and 1 Chronicles 6:33. Samuel's genealogy is mentioned and it traces him. In verses 33 through 38, it traces him all the way back to Levi, giving you his genealogy. then it goes on through various of the other tribes, and here in chapters 7 and 8. And chapter 9 goes into these genealogies and brings it down to the time of King Saul, and traces the genealogy of Saul and his descendants on down. And in chapter 10, the whole story of King Saul is summarized in 1 Chronicles 10. That's everything that Chronicles has to say about Saul, virtually. Chapter 11 begins the story of King David and runs all the way back, you see, to 1 Chronicles 29. So there's a vast amount of space that's spent. Now, we have focused on that portion of Chronicles that the study this evening gives, noting in 1 Chronicles 6 the genealogy of the Levites and the details of their inheritance. Let's go back to the book of 1 Samuel now and focus in on the first chapters here. We have the story in chapter 1 of the circumstances of Samuel's birth. His mother, Hannah, was barren, and you read the story in chapter 1 of her prayer to God and the answer to that prayer, which was Samuel's birth. And Samuel was dedicated by his mother to God as a Nazirite from birth, and this was the case as mentioned in verse 11, 1 Samuel 1, that he would be a Nazirite and was dedicated to God. And then when he was probably about 4 years old, it mentions until the time that he was taken to the temple after he was weaned, which would probably have been about 4 years old. That was customary, and still is in many of the Middle Eastern nations, that in many cases children are not completely weaned until they're at least 3 to 4 years old. I would suspect that since Samuel's mother was going to have to take him to the temple when she weaned him, she probably put it off, from a human standpoint. I would suspect that she weaned him late as opposed to early. Wouldn't you? Mother? So, in chapter 2, we have the story of Samuel as he was brought up there and brought to the tabernacle. Eli was the high priest. And Hannah, of course, went on to bear other sons, other children. But we note a serious problem. And I think it is important that we focus on it here in 1 Samuel chapter 2. In verse 12, the sons of Eli were sons of Belial. That meant sons of the devil. Belial was a term, a euphemistic term to refer to the devil. In other words, just saying they were a bunch of reprobates. They were sons of Belial. They knew not the Lord. The priest's custom with the people was that when any man offered sacrifice, the priest's servant came while the flesh was in seething with a flesh hook of 3 teeth in his hand, and he struck it into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot. All that the flesh hook brought up, the priest took for himself. That's what they did in Shiloh unto all the Israelites that came there. Before they burnt the fat, the priest's servant came and said to the man that sacrifices, give flesh to roast for the priest. He's not going to have any sodden flesh. He doesn't want it after it's been boiled. He wants it raw. He wants to barbecue it. He doesn't want it roasted that way. And if any man said unto them, well, let's make sure we burn the fat first, let's make sure we do it right, and then take whatever you want. he would answer and he'd say, "No, you give me now, and if you won't give it to me, I'll take it by force." Now, this is not the way that God had instructed the priest. Go back to Leviticus, there were certain portions of the animal that were to be burned, certain portions that went to the priest, and certain designated portions, then everything else went to the offering. Here, when people would come to the tabernacle, at this time, Eli's sons, they'd come up there or send their servants, and they'd reach in there and they'd grab everything that was worth getting. They got it for themselves. And if the offerer said, "Well, wait a minute, we haven't burned God's portion on the altar yet," they tough. So, we're going to get out. Verse 17, "Therefore the sin of the young men was very great before the Lord, for men abhorred the offering of the Lord." What do you think the attitude of people was in coming up to the tabernacle? You think they thought they were being ripped off? Of course they did. They were. They didn't just think they were. Now, let's come on down a little further. Verse 22, "Now Eli was very old, and he heard all that his sons did unto all Israel, how they lay with the women that assembled at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation." Women that would come up there to the tabernacle and would come up to worship. These priests were on the make. They were looking out for some woman they could proposition. It wasn't safe to bring your daughters. If you did, you better keep a good eye on them. Now, what do you think was the general attitude and respect that people had for the priesthood about this time? What do you think was what kind of respect and what kind of attitude? What would have been the answer had you lived at that time? What would you have done? This question was posed, I'll never forget Dr. Hay posing this question back during the mid-70s to certain individuals who were very upset because of certain similarities by individuals who were in comparable positions at Eli's sons, and there were those who were very upset by it, and Dr. Hay pointed out the account of 1 Samuel 2, and he said, what would you have done in the time of Eli? Gone off and worshiped Dagon? You're going to go off and join the Philistines because the priests of God aren't doing what they ought to do? Is that the solution? No, that's not the solution. The solution is you come and you worship God. Keep an eye on your daughters and your wife. Maybe leave them at home. But, come and do what you need to do. And if the priests steal what pertains to God, God will deal with them. Did God deal with them? You bet He did. That's the rest of the story. Paul Harvey said, now for the rest of the story. It's a crucial lesson. I bring it up. And I think it's something we need to emphasize as we go through, because the tendency is, when we find ourselves in a time of problems, we seem to think that it's unique, and things are going on and God doesn't know, and if I don't fix it, it won't get fixed. Which is not why God has given us the Bible. He's given us the Bible, among other things, that we might know whatever circumstance in which we find ourselves, others have found themselves there earlier. And we can read the story of what happened to them and how they handled it. And we can see those who handled it wisely, and we can see those who handled it unwisely. And we can read the story and understand the principle, and then when we find ourselves in something similar, we know how to handle it. You know the way to handle it? The same way Samuel did. See? Samuel grew up in all of that garden. Verse 18 of 1 Samuel 2, Samuel ministered before the Lord being a child. Samuel went about doing what he was supposed to do. In verse 26, the child Samuel grew on and was in favor both with the Lord and with men. Samuel grew up in that context, doing what he ought to do. And you know what? God blessed him, and God used him and worked through him. From the time he was 12 years old and up, He was the only one in Israel God was speaking to. You know, you think about that? I mean, the state of the nation was so bad that a 12-year-old kid was the only one that was on speaking terms with God. I mean, that's kind of bad, right? You have to understand what a slap in the face it was to Eli when when God spoke directly to Samuel in a dream. Eli was the high priest. And revelation was to come to the high priest. And God got so disgusted with Eli that by the time Samuel was 12, Samuel's attitude, he was still a child, but he was a sincere child. And God had more respect for a sincere kid than for, someone who was a lot older and should have known a whole lot better. And so God simply ceased speaking to the high priest for years. For years. Probably a period of 20 years. Is that God simply didn't speak to the priest, to the high priest. If he had a message for the high priest, he sent it via Samuel. So here is the situation, and it was a terrible state of things. When the conduct of those in leadership positions is like this, it causes God's people to have an attitude of disrespect. Certainly it did. And it was a very serious matter. And so we find here that you see the statement here we read in verse 22 how Eli's sons were even propositioning women who came to the tabernacle. And you know what Eli said unto them? Verse 23, why do you do such things? Boy, I hear of your evil dealings by all this people. You know, I hear bad things about you boys. No, my sons, it's no good report that I hear. You make the Lord's people to transgress. If one man sin against another, the judge shall judge him. But if a man sin against the Lord, who shall entreat for him? Notwithstanding, they hearkened not unto the voice of their father, because the Lord would slay them. You know, Eli would get on to them and say, boys, you boys need to quit doing that. But that was it. He refused to take the kind of strong, firm action that was necessary to take. He refused, even though he knew what they were doing. When he became aware of what they were doing, he couldn't bring himself to do what needed to be done. He would get on to them and they just laughed it off. They ignored it. They didn't pay any attention. They just kept on doing what they were doing. And Eli couldn't bring himself to take the kind of action that should have been taken. And God condemned Eli, verse 29, wherefore kick you at my sacrifice and at my offering, which I commanded in my habitation, and honor your sons above me. That's what God told Eli. He said, you honor your sons above me. Because you know what they're doing and you're letting them by with it. And you're honoring your sons above me. To make yourselves fat with the chiefest of all the offerings of Israel my people. So, God said that He was going to deal with it. God did. As we come on through the story, chapter 3 and verse 1, the child Samuel ministered unto the Lord before Eli. And the word of the Lord was precious in those days. There was no open vision. You know, there was very, very little. The word of the Lord was precious. You didn't find it. It was not commonly available. So then we have the occasion here when Eli laid down and Samuel was asleep, and God called Samuel. And Samuel thought Eli was calling, and he got up and ran in there, and Samuel did not yet know the Lord. The word of the Lord was not yet revealed to him. He was just a young boy. Josephus tells us that he was 12. It refers to him as being a child in chapter 3, verse 1. No reason to dispute the Jewish tradition on the subject. So anyway, 3 different times this occurred. Well, after the second time, Eli realized what it probably was. He told Samuel what to say, and Samuel did. And what God told Samuel was a message for Eli. And verse 13, I've told him that I will judge his house forever for the iniquity which he knows, because his sons made themselves vile, and he restrained them not. You know, they just went from bad to worse, and he didn't do anything about it. And the result was their example caused the rest of the nation to sin. It caused the rest of the nation to hold God, to lose respect for God and God's way. You know, it's one of the tragedies or the perversities of human nature. So what is the normal human reaction when you find out that someone is a hypocrite? Someone who has been telling you certain things is a hypocrite. You know what the normal human reaction is? Oh, well, that sorry guy, what does he mean telling me to do this? Oh boy, he was doing the other. Why should I do this? Well, why should I do this if he's going to do that? If he can do that, so can I. You know what Jesus said to do? Those over you are hypocrites. The Jews in Christ's day, those over them were hypocrites. The Pharisees. The religious leaders of Christ's day were hypocrites. That's not an opinion, that's Jesus' statement. He said, he called them hypocrites and sons of the devil and everything else. You know what he told the people in Matthew? You know what he told them? He said, the scribes and Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. All that they bid you do, that do and observe, but don't do after their work. For they say and don't do. He said they don't practice what they preach. You practice what they preach, but you don't practice what they practice. You don't do what they do, you do what they say. They're telling you things that are correct, but they're just not doing it. So show honor to the office and follow what they say, but don't follow their example. And that, of course, goes against the grain of human nature. But it's an important lesson to learn. Doesn't matter if someone is not doing what they ought to do. That's an excuse that's just not going to wash with God. I don't think we want to find ourselves, I certainly don't want to find myself in for what we know. One of the things to understand about God's government, God governs. He governed in ancient Israel. He governs in His church. But God's government doesn't mean that God has never allowed human beings to do things they shouldn't do. God doesn't stand up there just kind of manipulating it all like a puppeteer with puppets. There may have been a time when some of us thought that was the way God did it. But God's government is not only in the church, God's government's in the family too. It says so in 1 Corinthians 11. That the head of the woman is the man, the head of the man is Christ, the head of Christ is God. That's God's government. You got the chain of command right there. Ladies, does your husband ever make a mistake? Does Christ govern through him perfectly? Well, you don't have to answer that. The point is that God sometimes governs less directly than maybe we had imagined. But the point is, God does govern. God does deal with things. When you come on through the story here in Samuel, did God deal with Eli and his sons? You bet He did. And He dealt with them severely. And has God dealt with those right on down to our time? Yes. But sometimes a circumstance is allowed to hang on for years. That seems a long time by our standards. By God's, it's like that. If 1,000 years is as a day, what's 20? What's 20 years? Well, I don't know. If you want to divide it up, what would that be? 1/50th of a day? About 30 minutes? That's not long. It's a little different. God's perspective on things. Our perspective is right here, right now. God's perspective is eternity. And sometimes God will, one lesson. God knows that if we can learn to be loyal to His government today when it is being imperfectly administered by human beings, we'll never in the world have a problem throughout the rest of eternity being loyal to His government when it's being perfectly administered by Himself. He never has to worry about us being another Satan and rebelling. If we can learn to be loyal to His government when it's being imperfectly administered, it'll be a snap to be loyal when it's being perfectly done. It's something that God has allowed all the way down. We see these examples here. So, here is the circumstance. And then in 1 Samuel chapter 4, we go on. The Philistines were going to war with the Israelites. And I might mention that this first period of time is contemporary with the account of Samson in the book of Judges. Eli was the high priest during the time that Samson was the judge. So if you really want an idea of the moral state of the people, if the priesthood was functioning on the level of Eli's sons, and then in the secular realm, the judge, who was God's representative, was carrying on like Samson was, you kind of get the idea that there weren't a whole lot of good examples around to follow. Can you do what you're supposed to do even in that circumstance? Yes, you can. Samuel did. Even if you find yourself a minority of one. Samuel didn't try to lead a revolution. He didn't try to take it into his own hand. He minded his own business and did what he was supposed to do, and he quietly, sincerely obeyed God. And years later, God put him in a position to do something about it. Mr. DeKoch found himself in a situation for years in Pasadena as first as a local elder, and for years there, and even afterward when he was pastoring one of the churches in the headquarters area, as an individual who certainly saw a lot of things that should not have been. But he was powerless to do anything about it. What did he do? Did he get mad and leave the church? Did he go off and try to rebel and do his own thing? No. He tended to his business. He did his job. He quietly, sincerely served God. In God, in His own time, in His own purpose, when He was ready to do it, all of a sudden, before you knew what was going on, God had altered things in a way that people would never have imagined. So, God is the same. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Sometimes things drag on, but if we're doing what we need to do, God will take care of His business in His time. Well, in 1 Samuel 4, this fight was going on. We see the state of the Israelites. They'd come to where they kind of regarded the ark as a good luck charm. They were going out to battle. They said, what we need is to get our good luck charm out here. That was kind of the way they regarded it. They weren't obeying God. The priests weren't obeying God. They went back and got the thing. Phinehas and Hophni brought the ark into battle, and promptly they were killed by the Philistines. The ark was taken captive. Eli, when he got the news, fell off backward off of his seat and killed and died. Probably broke his neck. He was 98 at this time, a very elderly man, and fell off backward and died. Now, in chapter 5, the Philistines took the ark and they brought it to where they were. And the first thing they were going to do is kind of put it as a trophy, see, in Dagon's temple. Now, notice that God has a sense of humor, and it's brought out in chapter 5. Early the next morning when they got up, Dagon had fallen on his face on the earth before the ark. Dagon was this idol of theirs. The bottom half of him was like a fish and the top was like a man. And Dagon was set up on his perch. And when they got up and came in the temple the next day, Dagon had fallen off his perch and was laying down. It was as though he had fell down to worship before the ark. Well, it shows the difference, you see. What did they have to do? Well, they had to pick their God up and set him back up on the perch again because he couldn't get up on his own. All he was a piece of carved stone. Well, they got up the next morning and he was fallen upon his face to the ground, verse 4, and the head of Dagon and the palms of his hands were cut off upon the threshold. You ever wondered why it's considered unlucky to walk on the threshold? Well, that's where it goes back to. It goes back to an old pagan superstition. It goes all the way back to Philistine. It's what it says. Verse 5, you see, from that time on, they wouldn't tread on the threshold. They quit doing that because Dagon's head and hands broke off on the threshold. Well, this was kind of embarrassing. Their God kept falling over and now he was falling apart. And now the hand of the Lord was heavy upon them, verse 6, and he smote them with emerods. You know what that is? That's hemorrhoids. That's just an old English spelling of hemorrhoids. So the men of Ashdod saw that this wasn't going to work. And this didn't take all that long before they decided this was a plague they didn't want to have to live with. And they called together a conference and they got all the lords of the Philistines and they said, "What are we going to do with the ark of the God of Israel?" He said, "We got to do something with this thing, boy. This is a painful circumstance." So they said, "Well, let's carry it down to Gath." I know what we'll do. Ashdod had wanted to see it was a trophy, so they wanted to say, "I tell you what, we were being selfish to keep it here in Ashdod. I'll tell you what, we'll let you guys down in Gath have it. You want it?" And so they carried it down there. And then the people of Gath found out why the ones in Ashdod were so glad to get rid of it. Because he smote the men of the city, small and great, and they had hemorrhoids in their secret parts. So they were in dire straits also. So then they sent it over to Chron. See, they were passing the buck. You ever know, human nature hadn't changed. It was like they got it and they didn't know what to do with it, and they thought, all of a sudden, "Hey, Chron, didn't you want this thing? Weren't you wanting this? I'll tell you what, I'm going to be a nice guy. I'm going to let you have it." So they passed it on around, and by the time it made a few cities, word began to get out, this is not a trophy you want in your city. So then they called a conference and they said, we better do something. So this ark was in the country of the Philistines 7 months. And they called the priests and the diviners and they said, "What are we going to do with it? We've got it. It's kind of like getting a tiger by the tail. How do you turn it loose?" See, this was the question. We've got it. Now, how do we get rid of it? And they said, if we send it back to Israel, we better not send it empty. We better do something. I mean, we want to get rid of these plagues. We're afraid just sending it back won't be good enough. Maybe we ought to offer a trespass offering. Well, they didn't. They were pagans. They didn't know what to do and what God expected. So they said, verse 4, "Well, what shall the trespass offering that we offer? What should we offer?" And they said, "Well, we'll offer 5 golden hemorrhoids." Now, I don't know what a golden hemorrhoid is, but evidently they made them, made 5 of them. And they made 5 golden mice, because evidently they had a plague of mice that ate up their grain. And they made these little idols. They thought, well, this would make a nice trespass offering. And this was according to the number of the lords of the Philistines. And so they made the images of the hemorrhoids and the images of the mice. And so they did that. And then they decided they didn't know how to transport it. So they thought, well, we'll make a new cart. Build a brand new cart that's never carried anything else, and we'll get 2 milk cows that have never been hooked up to a yoke before. And we'll tie these cows to the cart, and we'll take their calves home, away from them. And then we'll take the ark, and we'll lay it on the cart, and we'll put jewels of gold, which we'll return in a coffer by the side of it, and these little golden mice and golden hemorrhoids, and we'll stick them all up there on the cart, and we'll turn these cows loose, and we'll see what happens. Now, what would be the normal thing that would happen? You take a cow's calf away and take it back to the barn, you turn the cow loose, what's the cow going to do? He's going to head for the calf. You ever tried to hitch up something that's never been hitched before? That, again, that's not the normal state of things. We're going to see what happens. They said, we're going to do this, we're going to see what happens. Well, they did so, verse 10, and they laid the ark of the Lord on the cart, and the coffer with the mice and the images of their hemorrhoids, and the cows took the straight way to the way of Beth-Shemesh and went along the highway, lowing as they went, and they turned not aside to the right hand or to the left. Now, these old cows, they didn't fully understand what was going on. They were missing their calves. They were just lowing for all they were worth. But they took off with a straight path right back to Israel. Didn't turn aside from the right hand or to the left. Now, you think maybe God was getting a point across? God uses a little humor sometimes to make a point. He used Balaam's jackass to illustrate the fact that Balaam wasn't as smart as he thought he was. In effect, he made the point, why use the jackass to speak to him? Well, when God told Balaam not to go, Balaam tried to see if he could find a way around it. When God told the donkey not to go by putting an angel there in the path, the donkey stopped. And God got the point across to Balaam, in effect, look, that donkey's got more sense than you do. When I tell him to stop, he stops, and he doesn't try to go around me. I put an obstacle in his path, and he stops. I put an obstacle in your path, and you try to find a loophole. Now here, God, turned these two dumb cows loose with the ark, and you know what? They didn't go to the right hand or to the left. They followed the straight path. The Israelites had the ark. Did they go to the right hand or to the left? You bet they did. They wandered all over the place. They did anything but follow the straight and narrow. God showed Israel, look, these two old dumb cows exercise more sense than you do. They follow the straight and narrow. Well, the cows took the straight way. They didn't turn to the right or to the left. And, the cart came right up there right to the border and came right over in the border of Israel. And so God gave the Philistines relief. What they did wasn't exactly God didn't give any of those sacrifices. None of the ones they offered were mentioned back in Leviticus. You don't read of, of golden mice and golden hemorrhoids that were supposed to be offered as a trespass offering. But, they showed more respect for God and more respect for the ark and more respect than the Israelites did. And God respected them because in their ignorance and in their superstition, they showed a more sincere heart and they showed more genuine respect than the Israelites did. Because when it came back, when in verse 19 it says, God smote the men of Beth-Shemesh because they looked into the ark of the Lord. He smote 53,000 of them, or 50,070. They got the thing back. You know what some of them did? First thing they did, they wanted to peep inside and see what it was. They did not have respect for God. The law was, even the Philistines didn't do that. Even they didn't try to open it up and look inside. It shows, you see, the attitude and just the state of things. So they moved the ark again, and it was removed to this place, Kirjath Jearim. And verse 3, Samuel spoke, this is chapter 7, Samuel spoke to the house of Israel and said, if you return to the Lord with all your heart, put away the strange gods and serve the Lord only. and He'll deliver you out of the hand of the Philistines. The children of Israel put away their gods. Samuel told them to gather to Mizpah, and he would pray for them, and they prayed and fasted, and then Samuel offered a sacrifice, and then led Israel here, and they smote the Philistines. This coincides with the time of the destruction of the Philistine temple by Samson, and the destruction of Philistine power. And we find here that Israel, the Philistines, were subdued, and Samuel then judged Israel. Now, okay, and this is the momentous event that happened 20 years after the 20 years after the great debacle that saw the Philistines triumph over Israel. Was, of course, this event of the Philistines being conquered that is mentioned here in 1 Samuel 7, where that where we find that 20 years is mentioned in verse 2 after the ark had been captured is when the Philistines were overthrown. This coincides with the death of Samson and the beginning of Samuel's judgeship. Samson, of course, had been in captivity a great deal of that time, as you remember the story. Okay, in chapter 8 now we go down to a later period in Samuel's life. He was old. He made his sons judges over Israel. His sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after money. They took bribes and perverted judgment. And all the elders of Israel gathered themselves together and came to Samuel unto Ramah. And they said, Behold, you are old, and your sons walk not in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. Now consider the logic of that request. You're old, and your sons are judging in your stead, and they're not doing a good job. Make us a king, so that the office will always be hereditary, because we know that the king's sons will always do what they ought to do. That was not a very smart request. The reason that they really wanted a king was so that they could be like everyone else. Make us a king so that we can be like the nations. That was really what they wanted. But in verse 5, you see, you're old, your sons walk not in your ways. Make us a king to judge us like all the nations. We want to be like the world. We want to be just like everyone else. So, here, the statement is made as we come on down. Samuel was displeased. He prayed to God. God told him, do what they asked. But notice in verse 7, they have not rejected me. They have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. The people from their standpoint thought they were justified. Notice how God viewed it. God took it personally. They didn't trust Him to lead them. They wanted to take it into their own hands. So Samuel told them what they were going to get. Verse 11, this will be the manner of the king that's going to reign. Interesting times have not changed. Samuel told them that first thing he's going to do, he's going to take your sons and appoint them for himself. Verse 12, he'll appoint captains over thousands and captains over 50s. And he'll set them to ear his ground, reap his harvest, and make his instruments of war. And he'll take your daughters to be confectionaries, and to be cooks, and to be bakers. Then He'll take your fields and your vineyards and your olive yards. In verse 15, He'll take the tenth of your seed and of your vineyard and give to His officers. And verse 17, and He'll take the tenth of your sheep, and you shall be His servants. In verse 18, you will cry out in that day because of your king which you have chosen, and the Lord is not going to hear. The people said, no, we want a king that we may be like the nations. We want to be like everyone else. Samuel told him, he says, you know what it's going to be like when you have a king? You guys are going to gripe and complain and bellyache. Because what a king is going to do, first thing he's going to do is he's going to institute the draft. He's going to have military conscription. He's going to have the draft. He's going to have a great big bureaucracy. Big government. And he's going to have to pay for it, so he's going to institute taxes. Income tax. Interesting. Have you ever heard of fourth tithe? You've heard first tithe, second tithe, third tithe. There's fourth tithe, and this is where it is, right here. 1 Samuel 8:15. He will take the tenth of your seed. In verse 17, He'll take the tenth of your sheep. Fourth tithe, that's what the government takes. That's income tax. That's where it started. See, it started off with a tenth, and by the time of Solomon, it was oppressive. Well, you wonder, it doesn't say how bad it got. It just says it was so bad that people finally were ready to rebel because of the high taxes. But it evidently started off under Saul. He instituted, fourth tithe. This was the one that was for the government. So, what did God say was going to happen? He says you're going to have a big standing army, you're going to have the draft, you're going to have big government, big bureaucracy, you're going to have income tax and all kind of taxes to pay for all of these shenanigans. And you're going to gripe and complain and lament and bellyache, which is what people have been doing about the government ever since, all griping about the government. And God says, you know what? I'm not going to hear you in that day. You have what you asked for. You want human government, you're going to get the consequences of human government. But they wanted to be like everybody else. That's what they got. Well, in chapter 9, we have the story of Saul. Saul was, in verse 2 of chapter 9, he was a very outwardly striking individual. He was a big man. He was head and shoulders higher than any of the people. That would indicate he was probably in the neighborhood of 7 feet tall. Because he was head and shoulders above anybody else, which would indicate somewhere approaching 7 feet. Was a very striking individual in terms of size. He was the one that was going to be picked out. Saul, though, Saul was a big man, but he didn't have a big opinion of himself. It was his response when Samuel told him that he was going to be king in chapter 9, verse 21, am I not a Benjamite of the smallest of the tribes of Israel, and my family the least of the families of the tribe of Benjamin? Later on, when he was publicly chosen and anointed in chapter 10, verse 21, when they called for Saul, the son of Kish, when they sought him, he couldn't be found. Verse 21, they inquired of the Lord a little further, and the Lord answered, behold, he's hidden himself among the stuff. He went and hid in the closet. When he heard his name called out, he was all embarrassed to get up in front of everybody, and they finally found him. He was hiding in the closet. They dragged him out and up on the stage. And here he was. And he was higher than any of the people from his shoulders and upward. And Samuel said to all the people, see whom the Lord has chosen. And the people shouted, God save the king. So Samuel told the people the manner of the kingdom, wrote it in a book, and laid it up before the Lord. This is, of course, in other words, part of Scripture. And Saul went on back to his house, went home to Gibeah, and certain few men went with him. But really, for the first 20 years of his reign, he basically did nothing, or did very little. And finally, when the Ammonites invaded and tried to intimidate Israel, that stirred Saul to action. And the last 20 years of his reign are what we read of beginning in chapter 11 on. That one of the things to understand, Saul was an individual who had what we would term low self-esteem or an inferiority complex, as we would use the terms today. It's not uncommon that people may be aware of their own lack and may have certain feelings of inferiority. There are two different ways to handle it. You can contrast the way Saul handled it with the way Moses handled it. You see, Moses was also an individual who felt inadequate for the job. But Moses' response was to get out of the way and let God do it, since Moses knew he couldn't. Saul, instead of going that route, began to try to bluff and bluster his way through and to bully and intimidate others to cover up how he felt about himself. And the more time went on, the more he began to do that, the more unbalanced he became, and ultimately completely out of touch with reality, and to the point that he had serious mental problems and was even having difficulties with demons. He responded to his problems in the wrong way. Instead of going to God to cover his inadequacies, Saul tried to cover them himself by bullying his way through and intimidating other people. And that is not the way to deal. You know, there are times that we're all in a circumstance where we know we're inadequate. Well, the solution is not to try to bully your way through and intimidate others to keep them from finding out how you feel about yourself. Rather, it's to go to God and acknowledge your inadequacy and look to God to do it. Let God do it through you. And it's incredible what God can do through us when we get out of the way and let Him. You might contrast the story of Moses and Saul. Okay, Samuel then gave parting advice to the people in chapter 12. We read, it's pretty well summed up in verses 23 and 24 here of 1 Samuel 12. He kind of recaps the story up until now and tells them, you know, that I'm going to continue to pray for you, and I'm going to teach you the good and the right way. Fear God and serve Him in truth with all your heart. So, then in chapter 13, we continue on the story here of Saul after 1 year into the second part of his reign, this final 20 years. We see the result. We see how erratic Saul is in dealing with things, that he made this presumptuous or foolish vow, and well, in chapter 14, I'm skipping. Okay. The first great sin of Saul after he became king, we find here in 1 Samuel 13. They were gathered here to battle and going against the Philistines. And this was about 40 years after the earlier conquest of the Philistines. Things have kind of bounced back. And Samuel told him, I'm going to be there. And Samuel, of course, was a Levite. He was the one to offer the sacrifice. Samuel was not a Levite. He had no right to offer the sacrifice, but Samuel was late. Samuel was late. And Saul got impatient. He decided he would take things into his own hands. And so he offered the sacrifice himself. And Samuel told him that he had done very foolishly. This was a very, very foolish thing, because he should have done what he was supposed to do rather than being presumptuous. Chapter 14, this foolish vow where he vowed to fast until sunset for himself and all of his men during the heat of battle. This is in 1 Samuel 14, 20 through 24. Jonathan, his son, who hadn't known of the oath, ate some honey. And Saul would have executed him if the people hadn't intervened. So you kind of get the state of how impulsive that Saul is, and then that he's ready to charge off in one direction, and people put pressure on him, and then he goes and does something else. Well, in chapter 15, Saul had been given a commission to wipe out the Amalekites. Verse 3, utterly destroy all that they have and spare them not. Every body, every animal, everything that pertained to the whole nation of the Amalekites to be wiped out. And what do we find? Well, Saul spared Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive in verse 8. He killed everybody else but Agag, and evidently Agag's family, because later on in the book of Esther we read of Haman the Agagite, who had a thing against the Jews. If Saul had done his job the way he should have, there wouldn't have been any Agagites. So that goes to show you, you see, you don't do what God says, it can come back to haunt you generations down. This is verse 9 of 1 Samuel 15. Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep and of the oxen and the fatlings and the lambs and all that was good. Everything that was vile and refuse, that they destroyed. They didn't do what God said. Samuel was sent down there by God, and he came in and said hello to Saul, and Saul said, well, boy, I did everything just like you said. And Samuel said in verse 14, well, what is all this bleating of sheep and lowing of oxen? You did what I said, where did these come from? Samuel said, well, now they, the people, they were going to spare these and they were going to offer them for sacrifices. In verse 17, Samuel said, when you were little in your own eyes, you were made king. And now here, look what you've done. You've gone and just fallen on the spoil. And verse 22, latter part of the verse, behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, to hearken than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, He has also rejected you from being king. So, this is the whole point. Rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft. Saul would not do what God said. He kept wanting to amend it and do a little differently. Well, verse 32, Samuel said, bring here Agag, the king of the Amalekites. And Agag came unto him delicately. You can believe Agag was walking lightly. He was hoping to kind of skim this one through. But he didn't. And Agag said, surely the bitterness of death is past. Well, hey guys, bygones be bygones, huh? Forgive and forget, right? Samuel said, as your sword has made women childless, so shall your mother be childless among women. And Samuel hewed Agag in pieces before the Lord in Gilgal. So Samuel dispatched what Saul had been unwilling to do. Notice that Agag was singing a little different tune when he came out there. He was not quite what he had been a little earlier. But from this time forward, Saul was through as king as far as God was concerned. Yet he had years left on the throne. We're told that Samuel did not come before Saul again for the rest of his life. Samuel never came before him. Saul never sought out Samuel. But Samuel mourned for Saul. Samuel grieved for him. It really hurt him. He liked Saul. He cared for him. And it had high hopes for him. And it was something he mourned for him as long as he lived. And God looked down and it was... You see, God let the people have as their first king someone that they thought looked like a king. God let them have someone that they wanted. He gave them someone they were impressed with. They wanted a king like all the nations, and God gave them the one that, to all intents and purposes, was the most impressive man in Israel. And then the next time around, God gave them a man that outwardly was not very impressive. You remember the story of when Samuel went to anoint the sons of Jesse. And they all came in, and finally David came in the runt of the litter. And you know, he was the one they had out taking care of the sheep, and they didn't figure, well, you know, if there's anything important, it's certainly not going to be him. And God got the point across to Samuel that God looks on the heart. Man looks on the outward appearance, and God looks on the heart. God gave Israel, to begin with, a man with whom they would be greatly impressed. I can get some help to pass out these questions. God gave them, to begin with, a man with whom they would be greatly impressed. But there's a lot more to being a king than simply looking impressive. And that was a story that was there. Saul did not handle things in the proper way, and there was a lot of grief that came as a result. So this portion makes the transition from the story from the judges and the ups and downs of the judges to the time of the monarchy, and it makes the transition to the time of David. We find, again, how much space is devoted to David. You realize that the rest of 1 Samuel and all of 2 Samuel is focused in on King David. Now, the rest of 1 Samuel deals with David's life before he became king. 2 Samuel deals with David as king. And 1st and 2nd Chronicles deal with everybody else. Or 1st and 2nd Kings, rather, deal with everybody else. 1st and 2nd Kings deal with the others, and a large portion of 1st Kings deals with Solomon, and then it goes on through and takes the story historically step by step. But we have now set the stage for the establishment of the choosing of David. And that is what we will go through in the next Bible study in this series as we will complete the book of 1 Samuel and complete the story of Saul and the story of David from the time that God chose him until the time of Saul's death and the time when David would become king. Many, many lessons that there are for us in all of these accounts. It's not simply a matter of ancient history. It is a matter of many, many living lessons that deal with circumstances in which we find parallels right on down to our time today. So with that, we will be concluded this evening. Very good to see all of you, and I look forward to seeing you on the Sabbath. Good night.